So they developed this new drug. What's unusual about the process by which it receives its FDA approval?
A handful of things. So
We can
they,
insert Curtis Wright at any point here, by the way.
yeah, exactly. So there's a guy named Curtis Wright who was the medical examiner at FDA, who was kind of the Grand Inquisitor. He was the one they had to satisfy in order to get the drug approved, but also in order to get the marketing claims.
Maybe explain to folks why those two things are very important. Why is it that if you and I went into business tomorrow to create a drug, the FDA would have to approve it for, from a safety and efficacy standpoint, but then they'd also have to basically put guardrails around what we could actually say it's for. I don't think people fully understand that dual role there.
Well, I mean, it's the strangest thing. Richard Sackler, this second generation Sackler, is probably the most intimately acquainted with or involved with OxyContin. There's a point where he talks about how the package insert in a bottle of pills is our most potent selling instrument. And it's a strange thing, right? Because I think for the average consumer, you see that the sort of dense wording on that, and it feels like the fine print. It feels like something the doctors read. You may read it as well, but it doesn't feel like a marketing document.
Right.
But if you're the drug company, it's all about the indications. It's all about the claims that you can make for what kinds of ailments this medication might alleviate. And then also in terms of the kind of competitive positioning. So in the case of OxyContin, I'll give you a very extreme example. They didn't do any tests on the addictiveness of the drug. They didn't do any tests on the abuse liability of the drug. But there was a kind of hypothesis that they had at Purdue, which was because of the Contin system, you wouldn't have the kind of peaks and troughs of a sort of wave of euphoria when a big dose of the drug hits your bloodstream, followed by a kind of diminution and withdrawal. Instead, it's this steady, regulated, continuous flow. And their hypothesis was that because of that, it wouldn't be addictive and it wouldn't be subject to abuse. And that was a competitive advantage vis-a-vis other opioid products that were out there on the market. And you have this kind of crazy stretch where they start working very closely with Curtis Wright on the approval process. Some strange stuff happens. I mean, the company said, I don't even think this is in the book, but the company sends Curtis Wright, this is in the 1990s, this is 95. The company sends him a webcam. This is like a very early webcam where he can talk directly with folks in Stanford. Curtis Wright starts requesting that they send things not to his FDA office, but to his house. And at a certain point, a team of people from Purdue travel to Maryland and get a hotel room, and they spend 3 days with Curtis Wright, helping him write his reviews of their studies.
Let's just pause there for a second. It's almost impossible to imagine that happening, right? I'm not saying it didn't, because you've got the email proof that it happened. I'm just saying, from a matter of process, that statement is so difficult to comprehend. So how do we put that in perspective? What did other people at the FDA know at this point in time? What do we think emboldened the Sackler leadership to do that without fear of Curtis Wright turning to them and saying, "Are you freaking crazy?"
Yeah.
I mean, how does this unfold?
So it's really hard to say, and I've tried to kind of puzzle through this. And I should say, I mean, Curtis Wright wouldn't talk to me. I got him on the phone, and he very quickly hung up. He didn't want to talk to me about any of this. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the FDA, which they dragged their feet in the way that that federal bureaucracies always do. So I actually sued them in federal court to compel them to turn over documents to me. And I got a New York federal judge to order them to do document production to me, thousands and thousands of pages of documents. And my first request was for all the emails of Curtis Wright. And the FDA came back and told me that all of his correspondence and emails have either been lost or destroyed.
Yeah, which again, you couldn't make that level of malfeasance up. Like you can't, it's so ridiculous. Like how do they even say that with a straight face?
I know. Well, particularly given that I could understand if it was a sort of a document retention thing where after a certain number of years they eliminate stuff. In his case, though, this is a guy who had been, he was investigated by Department of Justice investigators, really starting in like 2002, 2003. This was somebody who was red flagged early by other federal agencies. The notion that that they would today say, it's the equivalent of saying like there was a very small warehouse fire. It's just that box, I'm afraid, that we didn't retain. It's pretty shocking to me. So I've tried to sort of puzzle this out. There's an interesting email chain. So some of this email has come out not through the FDA, but through federal investigations of Purdue. There's an interesting moment where one of the Purdue officials says that he happened to bump into Curtis Wright at a conference. This is as all of this approval stuff is happening. And they talked in a kind of a sidebar way. It was not formal. And my sense is that generally speaking, the FDA process, at least in theory, is one that it's pretty formalized, right? Because you don't want too much of an opportunity for improper influence to happen. And there's this interesting memo that the Purdue guy sends back to headquarters where he says, I got talking with Curtis Wright. It was great. We talked about the whole OxyContin thing. And he indicated that he would be open to other such informal exchanges in the future or something to that effect. So I don't know. I don't know how to make sense of it.
Wouldn't the Occam's razor response be the following? Given that a year after leaving the FDA, Curtis Wright is now employed by Purdue Pharma, isn't the only obvious explanation here that there was a quid pro quo, a very clear and direct quid pro quo made between Purdue and Curtis Wright?
So it's interesting. The former federal prosecutor, longtime federal prosecutor from the Western District of Virginia, who prepared really the biggest case against Purdue, and spent years poring over millions of pages of documents and looked really hard at Curtis Wright. He told me on the record, this is a guy who's pretty careful about what he says, and he told me on the record, I think a deal was made. He said, I can't prove it, just my opinion, but I think a deal was made. When you look at the totality of the evidence, it seems hard for me to believe any other, he's saying exactly what you are, any other explanation. I don't know that I need to go that far, and here's why. I don't think Purdue even needed to say, hey, make this work for us and there might be a job for you on the other side. I think that, and this is where from a policy point of view, this gets really hard to regulate, right? Is that the FDA is full of overeducated, really smart people who are making government salaries, and they have the unglamorous task of working on these approvals. And on the other side of the table is this huge multi-billion-dollar industry where you can make a lot of money and where there's a great deal of interest in former FDA officials, both in having them come and work at the firm because it's at the pharmaceutical firm because that's useful in a whole bunch of ways. But also, I would argue, I think there's probably a great deal of interest in having the FDA officials that you're talking to know that someday there might be a job for them. And that's this hard thing because it's not corruption in an explicit quid pro quo sense. It's not corruption in a way that's actually all that easy to police. Because if you're the FDA, what do you do? Do you say, okay, we're gonna have a cooling off period, once you leave the agency? How long? A year? 3 years? At what point do you start losing talent because people don't want to be locked up after they leave? I think these are, I don't mean to suggest for a second that these are easy questions, But I also think there's what I would call a kind of soft corruption that pervades this whole process. And I don't think it's unique to Curtis Wright. He's a very extreme example. But what you get is, in his case, as you said, he goes a year after OxyContin is approved, he goes and works at Purdue for 3 times his government salary. But to your point about the marketing claims, there's a line in the original package insert for OxyContin that says the Contin seal is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug. And that's a weird thing to have in a package insert in general, I think. I mean, it's a great marketing claim, but it's like, is believed doesn't seem very scientific necessarily.
What was the basis of that belief, the scientific basis? Was there a study that was cited? Was there an experiment that was done? I mean, it wouldn't be hard to have studied these things.
There wasn't one. No, in this case, what it was this conjecture that because of the Contin system, you're not getting the high highs and the low lows, and therefore it would make it less prone to abuse than other drugs. And the real measure of how compromised this line is that to this day, nobody will admit writing that line. So Curtis Wright has been asked about this, and he said, "Oh yeah, it wasn't the FDA, it was Purdue Pharma." And the Purdue Pharma officials who were there say, "Oh, it wasn't us, it was Curtis Wright." But I mean, to me, as a consumer, right, the idea that the FDA is working so closely with a drug company that literally you don't know where one ends and the other begins, and there's a line that ends up in the package insert claiming that this drug is safer than other alternatives, and nobody can tell you who wrote it.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Finally, I take conflicts of interest very seriously. For all of my disclosures and the companies I invest in or advise, please visit peterattiamd.com/about, where I keep an up-to-date and active list of such companies.